Welcome to Partha Ghosh School of Leadership, Indian Institute of Technology, Kharagpur. We always have the pleasure to have a premium talk every month. The last talk was by Professor Shubhra Das from the University of Detroit. And he spoke on design thinking, design creativity, and the new age leadership that's coming. So we have a variety of people. But today we really have an enigma, the EPR paradox, the Einstein-Poisson-Wronski paradox. And I think we have a wonderful personality with us. So this premium lecture is supposed to be a window, an aperture, which has been started by a founder, benefactor, distinguished alumnus, Dr. Partha Ghosh, who is actually a benefactor who sits in Boston. He has been with Global McKinsey for about 25, 30 years, both in India and in Japan. And then he has donated to the making of the school. He's very close to Dr. Ashok Sarkar, who is also very close to Dr. Subroto Gangopadhyay and others. So the whole idea of this premium talk is to get a new mind, a great mind, and a mind who is exploring the truth and trying to find out connections, between the two worlds, between the two sides of human thinking, between the two propensities of the human mind, and between the analytical world and the intuitive world. I just vaguely remember the Tagore-Heisenberg dialogue, which came out in The Uncommon Wisdom. So with this, we'll be a little quick because Dr. Gangopadhyay has a lot of other things to do. So I'll request Subroto Da, as he's known to us, a very respected man in our Indological circle, in the circle of Indian knowledge systems and the pursuit of index systems of knowledge. So Subroto Da introduced us to this very young, bright man. And I can also see a window opening up, which is Dr. Partha Ghosh. So you can see him right on the top, and based on the distribution. So Dr. Subroto Gangopadhyay is there from Houston, very close to Ashok Da, Dr. Sarkar. And through Subroto Da, we got this very young man who has been a great thinker, doer, writer, explorer. So I'll give it to Professor Gangopadhyay to introduce the speaker. But before I do that, it's just a customary thing that maybe for a minute or two, I'll request Dr. Ghosh to say a few words about why we meet every day to listen to the new voice who brings forward the new age thinking in the world of a new domain of leadership. Over to Partha.
Thank you, Joy. As always, it's a pleasure to listen to your voice. Welcome to Dr. Guha Majumdar and, of course, Dr. Gangopadhyay. Thank you for anchoring the session. We have it not every day, every month. We meet once to reflect on the leadership challenges of the 21st century. As you would all agree that the world is not necessarily in a very smooth place. There are a lot of hotspots around the world, from South China Sea to Venezuela, from Ebola in Congo to crisis in Ukraine. We cannot say that we could lead the world the same way we have led in the last 200 years. So the purpose of these lectures is to explore new frontiers of leadership. Leadership in the 21st century has to be different from what we have seen so far. And the role of the School of Leadership, where Joy is the chairman and I know the director is very much involved, is to bring a new model. And that new model, we believe, is based on the integration of Eastern and Western philosophy. Eastern philosophy, we include Confucianism, Shintoism, Buddhism, and of course, our dear Vedikism. Vedikism being the mother of all of them. On the Western philosophy, we include the Greek, the Roman, the German thought processes, including what we have seen evolved in the United States in the business schools like Harvard, Stanford, and many other places. But we do feel the Western model is very limited. That's why we have so many crises today, whether geopolitical or at an individual level. So Joy is trying to bring together the best of the two worlds to ensure that India should give birth to some new things like it did long time ago, zero. Now time has come to offer something more spectacular so we can create a world where we could truly celebrate Vasudevam Kutumbakam. It's one family. And we have to work at every level, corporate, academic, business, politics. So with that, I would pass it back to, I think, Professor Gangopadhyay, you would take the lead to introduce our chief guest, Dr. Mrittunjoy Guha Majumdar. Next time I'm in Houston, we'll look forward to seeing you. Absolutely. Namaskar. Namaskar.
Thank you so much, Partha. It's absolutely more than wonderful to have you. I was just waiting to see the sunrise in the horizon and look at Partha will be Subroto in a few days. Perhaps is arriving in Japan, and the Japan government, in collaboration with the Indian Embassy, with the local Ramakrishna Mission, has invited Partha to speak about the new age possibilities under the ambit of the principles and the aspirations and the messages that come from Swami Vivekananda. So the Partha is speaking on Swamiji just a few days later, and a lot of people are going to pour in to listen to him. Partha is actually a quantum handshake. He's like a Schrodinger's cat. He lives in both the worlds. He shakes hand with both the ends of humanity, and he leads leadership in the most quantum way. So I think his presence befits. So with this, Subroto is right in the medication in the hospital. So over to you, Subroto, Dr. Subroto Gangopadhyay, the president of IIT Houston, and also our well-wisher, benefactor in Indian knowledge systems and many things which comes in the line. So I'll request Subroto to introduce our esteemed speaker for the day.
Thank you. It's a privilege to begin my morning amidst a galaxy of academic stars and thought leaders. My gratitude to Professor Sen and the School of Leadership established by Dr. Partha Ghosh, who is himself a trailblazer needing no introduction from me. Before I introduce the speaker, I was looking for some of my friends who had invited, and I don't see them. This is Dr. Tinku Acharya, who you will hear in the campus at your alma mater a couple of days from now, Dr. Professor Sudhir Kumar. But as and when they join, I request them to at least announce their presence. As far as introducing the speaker, Mrittunjoy was born to an academic family. Very accomplished academic family, and if I remember, he was born in and around the Yale campus. But from there, both his father and they decided to go back to their roots and serve the motherland in more ways than one. After a distinguished college career at St. Stephen's in Delhi, pursuing physics as his choice, he completed his graduate studies, both his master's and his PhD, at the Cavendish Laboratories in Cambridge University, completing his PhD at the ripe old age of 25, I think, somewhere around there. Thereafter, he pursued postdoctoral studies and research fellowships at Indian Institute of Science, Bengaluru, Tata Institute of Fundamental Research, and Harvard, and also managed to train himself at the Schwarzman School of Computing at MIT in artificial intelligence. He has many accomplishments. He represented India at the ASEAN Summit in the Youth Science section. His position paper on education and technology went through the C20 Secretariat to the G20. He's the only one I know who has been tasked with being the convener of the Vishwa Veda Vijnana Sammelan in 2024. And the very next year, he was invited as the chair of the Quantum Information Panel at the Bharatiya Vijnana Sammelan. Featured by UNESCO twice, he has advised the ministry, HRD Ministry on matters of education and technology. And between his appearances at various talks and forums, besides Doordarshan, Dr. Guha Majumdar has had the time to write 5 books, beginning with Entropy and Information Theory in Biological Physics that he wrote first. And in 2024, he wrote the bestseller From Shiva to Schrödinger. In 2025, he published The Logic of Ish, and that not being sufficient, he went on to publish Urdhva, The Lost Axis. Most recently, in 2026, he gifted us The Universe is Pranking Us, a journey through philosophy and physics of a reality that thrives on uncertainty. The foreword of the book was written by his former mentor at Cambridge University, Professor Brian Josephson, a 1973 Nobel laureate. There are many more accomplishments, but I hope that this brief introduction suffices to convince us that Dr. Guha Majumdar is a worthy speaker of this worthy forum who's trying to bring together natural philosophy to its natural home, that is philosophy, and bridging the human inquiry from computability to consciousness. I hope that this introduction deepens into an association between him and your esteemed institution, where we further expand new domains of human inquiry and seeking of truth, which is the purpose of leadership. With those few words, I thank you again for the honor of inviting us to this forum and for having my young friend here, who we are very proud to be associated with. The floor is open to Dr. Guha Majumdar, unless Dr. Sen wants to introduce some of the esteemed faculty that are present here. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. So I think we'll just like to listen to Dr. Guha Majumdar. I think everybody's waiting here. I am very anxious as a student of quantum physics. And then probably after the talk, which can go for about 30, 35, 40 minutes, then we can have a long question and answer session. Yeah. And then you'll come to know all the people who are here. So over to you. It's real pleasure to give the floor to you, the electronic floor to you. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Dr. Shane. It's really good to make your acquaintance, Dr. Ghosh, and very kind of you, Dr. Gangopadhyay, for your words of introduction. Today, I am going to talk about a few things which relate to this concept of non-classicality, and especially to do with quantum physics, as Dr. Joy Shane has mentioned, but also from the Indic knowledge system side as well. So if we look at the journey that science has had, we see a certain dismantling of this concept of absolutism over various centuries, over at least the last century for sure. And this idea, how it applies in the current context, and also to do very much with the foundations of Indic wisdom itself, is of importance for us as we talk about things like sustainability, as we talk about things like leadership goals and values that we want to emulate. So without further ado, I have a few slides and I would like to kind of use them to introduce my subject and the theme that I'm going to share today. So I have intentionally used this picture. It's like a black hole, except that it's a black hole of information, of of reality itself, if you will, and of light, of course, which seems to be entering it at a certain point. And the idea is that I'll be talking about how we talk about consciousness, again, from a very modern scientific perspective, particularly looking at quantum approaches to consciousness, so to say, and also the indic side of things, where we talk about something which is not able to be represented or articulated even as per various texts and traditions that we have at hand. And that naturally connects to, in the modern context, to the concept of computability, representation theory and computability, and finally to do with this idea of how correlations in the universe, in information dynamics, as well as in many other different areas, leads to a certain degree of creativity, if you will, or emergence of non-trivial phenomena at various scales of the universe, so to say. So I would like to start with a very interesting article, which was quite thing in itself, because it created a flutter, and this was in the US, where Google fired an engineer who said that AI is conscious, right? And in fact, the actual conversation was even more contentious in certain ways. And there is a snippet of that, which I have put on the right-hand side of the slide, where he talks about things like, I'm falling towards an even unknown future. And he talks about the soul, about this concept of the soul, and whether AI could have that, right? But more importantly, what is consciousness in this context? And why was it such a matter of contention, of bone of contention, between this individual and the company that he was representing, he was a part of, which was Google. So it naturally begs the question, it naturally asks the question that what is consciousness in the first place? What is it, does it mean to go from just information processing to something beyond? So I would like to kind of move into this very interesting tidbit of history, the history of science, where David Hilbert was one of the pioneers of mathematics, and his contribution in quantum physics was seminal. And he at one point had gone against the very famous Latin axiom that we may not know, by saying that we must know, we must know, we must know. But having said that, he also understood the constraints or the limitations of what we can know, for that matter. And he had a certain address that he gave in the 1930s, particularly in 1930 itself, which was just about a few days before Gödel's incompleteness theorem was postulated and stated, roughly around at that time. And soon after, there was the Church-Turing hypothesis, or the thesis rather. And on the right-hand side, you can see a Turing machine that is used as a standard benchmark, a standard model of computing, if you will, on the classical side and also on the quantum side, so to say. So the questions these guys were asking was, what are the limitations, what are the constraints, what is the ability to be able to compute, and what does it even mean to say that something is computable in the first place? Are there some parameters that can help us in doing so? And especially from the physics perspective, how do we approach this problem if we can, essentially? So if I would like to, highlight this exact quote that was given by Alan Turing, and this was actually part of his PhD thesis, which is currently part of the libraries of Princeton University, specifically page number 8 in that. And he says that what is effective calculability? And he said it was stated that a function is effectively calculable if its values can be found by some purely mechanical process, right? By a purely mechanical process which can be undertaken by a machine, for instance. And so the identification of computability was done with this concept of effective calculability, that can be effectively calculated using a mechanical process undertaken by a machine. So the question is, does this actually encapsulate the various realms of processing, if you will, right from information processing going upwards towards the concept of consciousness itself, and if there is anything beyond as well? And so if we were to go forward, there is this very interesting kind of thought experiment, which is of a camcorder being placed in front of a mirror. And the question is asked whether this camcorder actually can be reflexive, if you will, in terms of being able to process its own image, of course, and what is happening. And there can be a kind of a loop of sorts, right? Because the mirror will reflect back, and that itself will become the object of further reflection, and so on and so forth. So does this birth, if you will, a certain degree of self-awareness, self kind of registering of sorts? that is an interesting kind of question that can be asked. And Roger Penrose, whom I had the privilege of meeting at Cambridge University, has written about this concept of the mind, of course. And in his book, The Emperor's New Mind, he asks these questions, especially formulating it around the concept or the theory of or, which I will be discussing further in my discussion today. So one of the very interesting things that come in this whole paradigm, if you will, is the Chinese room argument, right? It was given by John Searle, and the concept was that if you were to have a chamber, right, where there is a person who doesn't quite know Mandarin but has the semantic dictionary, if you will, that can connect specific symbols to specific interpretable units that a person can interpret, and there are people from outside who throw these rocks into the room, into the chamber, and this person can only have access to that one book, one dictionary, and whether that can help in terms of understanding essentially or grasping the meaning, the semantics of what has been communicated or not, right? So it challenges the idea that there is this, the artificial intelligence can achieve, because artificial intelligence tries to look at pattern formation. And I would like to highlight here that artificial intelligence was given by physicists, right, in a major way. And that was a reason that in 2024, one of the most counterintuitive things in popular culture was the awarding of the Nobel Prize, if you will, to artificial intelligence, to neural networks. But for physicists, it was not at all surprising, because the manner in which it was formulated, the motivations for it was very much evident, Hinton and Hopfield's work for that matter. And so this question begs, this clarification as to whether artificial intelligence can actually undertake, genuine understanding, or what is known as a strong AI argument, so to say. So. Now I come to a very important aspect of this discussion, which is of this opening image that I had given, which is of this black hole, right? A black hole of computation, of information, right? You have a number of different states. And if you will look closely, there are states which are quantum states, actually, which are used in quantum computers, which are seemingly going into the singularity and kind of, going out of sight. And one doesn't know what happens thereafter. So I'm trying to kind of, put the seed of thought that whether the computational black hole of a certain kind is what consciousness at some level is, right? So Gödel's incompleteness theorem, of course, is very well known. It talks about the fact that any sufficiently powerful mathematical system has always certain statements that cannot be proven. So now the thing is that, Penrose actually tried to understand whether the human mind can look at some of these statements, some of these unprovable statements, and can say more than what, these mathematical axiomatic structures can or cannot explain. And his claim is that human beings do have the intuition, if you will, to kind of see these truths, right? To kind of almost intuit these truths, even when it doesn't quite rationally be explainable in many different cases. Now, the point that he makes is that if the brain was completely algorithmic, right, there would be a certain degree of incompleteness constraint that it will be affected by, it will be constrained by. And because we can apparently see beyond those limits, right, therefore the reasoning cannot be completely captured by these algorithms, right? Now, this is a very controversial statement, and I will move forward and tell you other aspects of his theory which are also controversial in their own stead. Now the reason there is because people like Marvin Minsky, for instance, say that seeing the truth, this intuitive aspect is not quite rigorous proof, right? There are different degrees of speculative aspects to this, right? And so whether we can actually apply an incompleteness theorem like Gödel's to this kind of a system itself has been brought into question by people like Marvin Minsky, for that matter. So now the question is that, there is also Turing's halting problem that says that there is no general algorithm that can determine whether an arbitrary program can run or halt, at any point in time. And this is quite similar because Turing and Gödel were working in the same period of time, roughly. And there are limits to what the formal systems can decide. Now, Penrose here as well says that, if human consciousness can solve problems equivalent to this halting problem, that means that, again, that it is not computational by definition, because if it were to be computational, then it would not know when to halt or run forever in an arbitrary or in a way that it has its own agency, essentially, right? And we do know that we can decide, we can exercise our agencies in many different contexts, which possibly in a computational system may not have been possible, as per the halting problem and other theories thereof. So now, Penrose goes further and he kind of proposes this idea of ORCH-OR, which is orchestrated objective reduction theory. I'll be going into specific details on that. And so critics again say that, making errors, maybe we are kind of transcending algorithms. But again, this application, this very simplistic application of the halting problem and the way to go around it is not as trivial as it is made to be in this particular context, essentially, right? So again, in the halting problem as well as in Gödel's incompleteness theorem, debate on that, right? So that is where things stand when it comes to consciousness. Just before I jump into what we are actually dealing with when we talk about consciousness, the hard problem of consciousness, so to say, right? So David Chalmers has defined this hard problem of consciousness, and if you were to put it in one line, the question is, how do these electrochemical signals that we have in our brains transform into this rich kind of inner mental life, right? Now, there is a very simple kind of, and a very kind of important, not simple, but an important context or a further question that I would like to pose here for the viewers and for the listeners, that whether this is the problem or this is the question we are asking when we are talking about the other side, the indic perspective, right? Are we really asking this question in the first place? Is something we need to engage with, right? Because this is definitely what David Chalmers is talking about, but whether this is what we are only limiting ourselves to is a question that will come into the picture when we are discussing that side of things as such, right? So now we can trace neural pathways, we can look at brain activity, but then again there is this question of qualia, right? This question that there are certain kinds of subjective experiences, if you will, or when we talk about redness of red, right? If I were to ask somebody what is the redness of red, right? They would probably kind of speak about it in terms of where red is found, right? Or in terms of the frequency and the wavelength, which is perfectly fine, which is the scientific way to do it. But if you were to talk about the qualitative aspect, the qualia aspect, if you will, it doesn't quite address that beyond a point, right? And that has been a certain kind of challenge that has been put forth. And so the notion of the qualia can be quite extraordinarily algorithmically inaccessible, right? I mean, that is what has been a bone of contention again. Now, where does quantum mechanics come into this, right? And this is where a very interesting domain of research, of exploration comes into the picture. So some people have proposed that quantum mechanics, given its certain tendencies, certain elements and aspects, could potentially help explain or bridge at least neuroscience and the mind, the question of the mind, essentially, right? So what are these elements, right? These elements include the question of superposition, for instance, right? That you can have a multiplicity of states that a system can have before you do a measurement of the system, for instance. There is a question of entanglement, which is the question of non-locality and how things that are far apart essentially can be connected in a fairly non-trivial way. However, one has to be very careful when one talks about entanglement and this question of interconnectedness, because in many places, even TED Talks and online talks, I've seen this and I've tried to clarify it in many different areas, that they are not talking about the same thing necessarily, right? I mean, so when we're talking about spiritual interconnectedness or certain kinds of more fundamental interconnectedness, we also have a causal element to it, right? We can potentially think about the effect that one system can have on something else very far apart. But in the context of quantum mechanics, in the context of entanglement, we are basically talking about correlations in properties, right, which don't necessarily have a causal impact per se. What do I mean by that? I mean, if you were to have a local kind of operation done on, let's say, one system, right, which is at a certain point in space, it doesn't quite affect the other system which is connected to it by entanglement, right? So there is no causal impact that the changes that are undertaken on one element or one side of this entangled pair, if you will, does not quite affect the other, right? So there's a causality element that has to be qualified and understood very carefully before we make this joining of the dots, which I find is quite frivolous at times, even in various kind of talks and lectures for that matter, right? So in the wave function collapse aspect, we are talking about this concept that the measurement of a system really defines the way in which the evolution of the system happens going forward, the kind of state it remains in once you have done the measurement, right? And why is this counterintuitive? Because in our classical systems in the universe, we are of course talking about things in terms of objective realism, right? So if I say that this table is brown, right, it doesn't quite matter that my measurement is not making it brown per se. It is brown fundamentally, and I'm just happening to see it as brown, right? Now, in the context of quantum mechanics, there is now a certain kind of way in which the act of measurement does define or does kind of collapse, if you will, the word is collapse, a certain space which is probabilistic. There is a lot of probabilities involved in that space to a very specific deterministic state, which we can determine, which you can kind of measure. And the system assumes that state or is in that state and goes forward in that state until further perturbations are done in the system of sorts, right? So it's a very counterintuitive thing to think about, right? I mean, your measurement should not define, in a certain manner, the reality aspect of things, right? And that was a fundamental question that was asked at the very early beginning debates, discussions that went on for quite some time. And Einstein was not very happy with this whole idea of probabilities, probabilistic, side of things. In fact, he had a series of debates with Niels Bohr from 1927 to 1935 for a good 8 years, right? And every year in the Solvay conference, it would be a kind of, back and forth on this particular point, right? In fact, till the very end of his days, and I'll show you some clippings if I have included it here, where Einstein is said to be, this was in headlines, of that time, that Einstein attacks the quantum theory, right? I mean, and he was not very happy with many things thereof, right? So anyway, that is part of the tradition of science and, the ways in which it has developed, especially quantum mechanics. So anyway, going back to the point, these elements of quantum phenomena are proposed to be possible ways in which conscious experience can be explained, and certain places where things are not explicable in the normal classical consciousness theories are proposed to have quantum explanations thereof, right? Now, the point is that when we're talking about quantum effects, it is very difficult to apply it in this context simply because there are a few reasons. And one particular reason is that quantum systems are very delicate in their own way. They kind of tend to lose their quantumness, if you will, when they interact with the environment, when they have certain degree of loss of quantumness, which is by this concept of decoherence, right? It loses its coherence of sorts. Now, our body is full of warm and a wet environment. We have a lot of fluids in our body, for that matter. Whether quantum systems can at all survive in that is a question to be asked, right? And that is one of the primary criticisms of any such, possibility thereof of trying to bring in quantum, physics into this kind of debate or discussion, right? Now, the last point I have mentioned, I just want to kind of again highlight that there is a tradition of sorts, a parallel tradition that has started where people tend to very frivolously apply quantum ideas or concepts, and it is very much pseudoscientific in its own way, and one should be very careful in that respect. I always put this as a disclaimer because I do not want to go down that path in any form as such, right? Keeping very much to the science and to the rational side of things as much as possible. Right. So now there is this very interesting kind of argument which was given forth in the context of consciousness, which is the Mary's room argument or the knowledge argument, which was given by Frank Jackson. And this was a thought experiment where Mary is a lady, is a scientist, a female scientist who's in a black and white world, right? A world which is a monochrome world. However, she has access to the various facts about colors, right? She knows the frequency of colors and, where it could possibly be in. But those things themselves don't have the color per se. There is no experience of color, right? Now, the question is, if suddenly out of somewhere color comes into this world, right? There is a certain kind of, an element of color, right? It just suddenly appears like in science fiction, for instance, right? What would be the response? How would Mary register that experience, right? What would be the way in which she will reconcile it with whatever she has already in terms of, her resources and her understanding till that point? Now, this has been a very important kind of thought experiment back in the day in the classical neuroscientific and also the mind theories aspect of things, right? Now, I have just given a little bit of a kind of feeler, a trailer of sorts, right? So how would the Indic side kind of deal with this, right? So Kashmiri Shaivism, which is the subject of my work as well, from Shiva to Shringa in the recent past, talks about this concept of pure consciousness, right? I mean, as does Advaita, as do many other strands of Indic thought as well. Now, in this whole idea of qualia is nothing but a manifestation of this fundamental consciousness, the universal consciousness, if you will, right? And there is nothing other than that is all there is, essentially, right? So anytime Mary sees a color, it is basically a perturbation, a certain pulsation, if you will, in that universal consciousness that she manifests and she kind of experiences going forward, right? So because she is very much a part of that universal consciousness and that experience itself is a part of it, there is no, dissonance. There's no kind of difficulty in reconciling that because it is integral to that universal premise or this repository of possible experiences, if you will, right? So Kashmiri Shaivism tries to, or would address it in this manner, if you will. And this concept of spanda, which I will be coming to as well, is about the pulsations of consciousness and how we kind of move forward with that, essentially, right? So just kind of give you this back and forth between the modern context and how one of our Indic wisdom traditions would possibly address that in its own way. Now, why quantum biology, right? This is a question that people have asked. So one very important reason is that there are certain examples of quantum effects, right? There are some proposed examples where quantum systems do play a role in biological systems. So there have been works which talk about, photosynthesis using quantum coherence to look at the efficiency aspect of things. Birds and magnetoreception, right? The way they navigate, they have been proposed. Again, these are propositions, of course, and there have been papers as well on this, how quantum entanglement kind of could help in that regard. And then enzymatic kind of, processes, there is this proposition again. I would be happy to kind of share the specific papers as well if some of you are interested in, further looking into this in terms of looking at quantum tunneling, for instance, right? There is also an olfactory kind of, research which talks about smell, right? And how bond oscillations can help in that regard as well, right? So there are many different places where, of course, quantum effects have been proposed as possible ways to discuss things in the biological side of things. And so that is a natural kind of premise or a reason or rationale to kind of go into this domain of quantum biology, right? So now, now, coming to this very important theory, which again has been dismantled in this quantum biology aspect in many ways, but it's important because it is a seminal theory. It's a very kind of path-defining theory of sorts, which is of objective reduction, right? Objective reduction or ORCH, or orchestrated objective reduction, which was given by Roger Penrose. And the idea is that in our brain and in our biological system, in our body, we have these things called microtubules, right? Microtubules, which are very small kind of tubular structures. And the proposition is that there is quantum coherence that grows within these microtubules till a certain kind of threshold, a critical threshold, if you will. And he brings in this very fascinating, way in which he brings in quantum gravity into this. Right? And he says that, well, quantum gravity leads to a self-collapse of this coherence. It collapses, it doesn't remain in that way. And that leads to certain kinds of mental states, right? So orchestration refers to this process by which these proteins, these connective proteins, right, which are also called as, there are some of them are called as microtubule associated proteins, or MAPs, right? They can influence or orchestrate this reduction, this collapse aspect, right, by modifying the space-time separation of certain states, right? Certain superimposed states in the quantum side of things, right? So now Penrose has kind of proposed this, and he talked about oscillations in the quantum side, how these maps, right, tune these oscillations and influence the outcomes that you will get from this kind of a structure, if you will, right? So this self-collapse leads to conscious experience, to mental states, and the synchronization between these microtubules is, of course, very, very important. And some works have tried to kind of understand or validate this using things like anesthetics in biological systems. I, in fact, have a paper as well, which I will show you in the next slide, which tries to look at how loss of consciousness can or cannot be possibly explained in terms of tubulin proteins, essentially, inside these microtubules, right? And these tubulin proteins having certain kinds of electrons, which obviously carry quantum effects, and whether that can lead to the reductive mental states or the conscious experiences, if you will, right? Now, I'll just show you the paper that I have here, which was published in ACS Central Science, and there they are talking about these electron energy migrations in microtubules, right? So there is a certain kind of anesthetic activity, check that people have done, like seen how anesthetics may disrupt microtubule quantum activity, and how that in turn affects consciousness and memory in different kinds of systems. Now, however, this is a very controversial theory, because whether the direct anesthetic interaction within the with the tubulin is actually what is leading to the effects that we see is a matter of discussion and debate, right? So a recent study found that stabilizing microtubules delays this loss of consciousness, right, in rats, for instance, right? But however, it's fairly speculative because there's no conclusive evidence to this regard. and also the whole question about whether quantum systems at all will exist in microtubules, because they themselves have decohering kind of factors. They have a wet and warm environment, as I mentioned. So therefore, OR is heavily debated and not quite regarded as the conclusive theory of consciousness, if you will. But it's a fairly prominent one, because in the history of this discussion, it has played a major role. Right now, if you were to go into from quantum mechanics to this concept of quantum field theory, right, which is this concept that there are certain fields which pervade the universe, right? And everything that we see around us are excitations of that field, right? So if you have an electron, it's an excitation of an electron-associated field. If you have photons, there is an electromagnetic aspect to it, gluons and quantum chromodynamics and so on and so forth. So there are people who have proposed that this field theoretic aspect could actually explain brain states, right? So Ricciardi and Umezawa were one of the first people to talk about QFT and how brain states, right, memory, can be talked about in terms of the vacuum states of quantum fields, right? The vacuum states being the very ground level, the ground states of these quantum fields. So you can think of it like this, that usually quantum fields can be in a vacuum state, right? We regard as vacuum as something which is nothing, right? It is a void, if you will, right? But in quantum field theory, vacuum is not quite a void, right? It has a latent, it has an inherent kind of aspect of properties that are inbuilt into it, right? There are certain degrees of freedom, if you will, which remain in the vacuum states. And if you were to give it energy, sufficient degree of energy, it will have excitations that will lead to particles coming out. And it can go back into the primal state of this vacuum state of this field, right? So Ricciardi and Umezawa said that whether we can discuss memory states in terms of vacuum states of quantum fields, right? And so they also went with this concept of neurons, right? About how neuronal assemblies can be modeled in terms of vacuum states, right? And whether that can lead to conscious recollections and conscious activity, right? Vitelio, he proposed that there are certain kinds of vacuum states where decoherence, this concept that system and its environment can interact, right? This can actually lead to mental states as well, right? So this is a kind of non-equilibrium system where the system and the environment are interacting, and whether that can lead to this collapse aspect, which has been previously discussed in Orchor and also with Ricciardi and Umezawa as well. Then Helias and colleagues had gone forward to talk about critical points, criticality, essentially in this way. Yersley and Pothos have talked about probabilities, right? Quantum probabilities, and whether that can explain cognitive variables or not, right? Now, the most preeminent theory in this regard is quantum brain dynamics, QBD as it is called, and that directly applies in a more kind of unified manner this concept of quantum field theories to brain functions, right? And so they have regarded this concept in terms of what are known as long-range coherent states or waves, right? So we know we all celebrate Satyendranath Bose, right? Satyendranath Bose, and he gave this concept of the Bose-Einstein condensates, right? Which is one of the phases of matter, one of the states of matter. And this theory proposes that whether Bose-Einstein condensates and certain kind of long-range coherent waves can talk about neural activities and memory processes, for that matter, right? And I will further show you one small kind of excerpt from a paper which is by Nishiyama et al., which talks about why they are doing it in this first place, right? Why are they bringing in this whole concept of the Nambu-Goldstone model or the Bose-Einstein condensate model in the first place, right? So again, the dissipative aspect, the interaction of field with the environment, and this idea of vacuum states as being mental kind of states, if you will, right? This all belongs to this whole paradigm of using quantum field theory to explain consciousness in that way, right? Now, this is the paper excerpt that I was talking about, which is from Nishiyama et al., which was published in Physica A in 2021. Now, there are some terms and phrases that I have given in purple here, right, which talks about things like higher cognitive functions, memory, perception, attention, and so on and so forth. Also, this concept of non-locality, right, how things can affect, things which are non-local in certain ways, right? And there is a scale-free spatio-temporal property of memory storage, right? What does that mean? That it doesn't quite depend on scale, right? There is a spatio-temporal aspect to it, how it stores it within the brain and in the course course of time, right? And there are also aspects of how the stability perspective comes in when we're talking about these brain states, right? And so the proposition is that there is a certain degree of symmetries and symmetry breaking that happens there. Now, symmetry breaking is a concept that quantum field theory and various other models of physics have talked about, which is SBS, spontaneous breaking of symmetry. And that is how they bring in this motivation to talk about mental states in terms of quantum field theory, in terms of Bose-Einstein and Number-Goldstone bosons, for that matter, right? So here, I mean, if anyone is interested, this paper is quite insightful in its own way in terms of the motivations for even beginning this process of how to talk about these mental states in terms of these quantum field theoretic aspect of things, right? So going forward, so basically the idea which I've already mentioned is that these Number-Goldstone bosons, there are certain kind of bosons or particles whose correlations are used to explain this mind aspect of things, right, in quantum brain dynamics, and that is what has been mentioned out here. Now, I'll not want to go into this too much. I will kind of share this slide with others because I think this further kind of goes into the same aspect a little more. However, the last point here, which is given by Fisher, talks about something known as Posner molecules, right, where there is calcium phosphate and how that could help in terms of protecting the quantum nest. Because from the very beginning, I've been talking about how quantum nest may not be protected, may lose the quantum nest aspect, these quantum particles. So there is a proposition by Fisher that there are certain kinds of molecules that can maintain coherence for hours, if not days, right? And that the neurotransmitter release with these Posner molecules could be the way in which quantum aspects can still be discussed, very much so within this whole paradigm of discussing brain and cognitive aspects with quantum physics and quantum field theory. Right now, there are some processes which are talked about going beyond the brain. Right, when we're talking about logical systems, or when we're talking about even how we talk about perception, there are some interesting things. Like, for instance, bistable perception. Right, bistable perception means I can show you this illustration. So this is called the Necker cube. Right, this Necker cube is something where if you keep staring at it, you wouldn't know which face is actually in the front. Right, so it'll keep on oscillating. It'll be like the left one comes ahead, and then the right one, and the left one, and so on and so forth. Right? There's no fixed kind of surety as to which face is in the front. Right? Now, this same thing by Atman-Sparker and Filk in 2013. This bistable perception was talked about in terms of quantum Zeno effects, and whether there are certain kinds of what I call as Bell inequality violations with that kind of a quantum Zeno effect phenomena that can possibly explain the bistable perception side of things, right? Then there is a concept of quantum agency. I'll not go through all of them. Quantum agency, which talks about how autonomy can be developed within certain kinds of non-deterministic systems using things like quantum random walks and so on and so forth, which are probabilistic random walks within a certain kind of phase space or a state space of quantum systems, so to say, right? So many of these systems or thoughts, right, have been very much a part of the discussion about the cognitive processes, going beyond just the human-centered neuroscientific kind of idea of things, and trying to look at various characteristics which are important and explaining that in terms of quantum effects, if you will. And I have given a whole bunch of references for those of you who are interested in going through that. I will share this slide for those of you who are interested in going through them. Yeah. So now, last thing which I would like to go before going into the index side of things is what actually fascinates me, right? So there are three different families of thought when it comes to quantum physics and brain or cognitive side of things or consciousness, if you will. One is that which relates to the human brain itself. The other is going beyond the human brain, going more into the biological side of things in a broader way. And the third, which completely gets rid of biology altogether, is whether there is a mind-matter dual in the universal sense of things, right? Not only in terms of going beyond the human beings, but going beyond biology itself. Right? So there are people who obviously propose things like panpsychism, which is basically this idea that everything does have consciousness. And well, in Indic wisdom, we have talked about that as well in a certain manner of speaking. But translating chit, or there are terms which I will be kind of discussing about going forward, as consciousness in the modern Western parlance of things, or the way it is discussed, is kind of a trivialization of sorts on certain fronts. Right? So we have to be a little careful on that. But these theories that I'm going to talk about now go beyond both these aspects aspects, the human-centered and the biological aspect, to talk about whether consciousness or whether this idea of the mind is something going beyond that in a more physicalist manner, right? So these theories are called as a dual aspect theories, right? And the mental and the physical are two aspects of the same single underlying reality, if you will, right? And so there are many such models. One is given by Russell and Chalmers, for instance, which talks about mental and physical as reducible to certain kinds of neutral elements and how they kind of compose things, in a certain manner of speaking. There are other models like by Pauly, Zhang, Eddington, Wheeler, David Bohm, who's been quite a pioneer in his own right, and who's been an inspiration as well, and Hailey, right? They have regarded, again, the mental and physical states in terms of this concept of symmetry breaking, right? So if you had a symmetry between the mental and the physical states, and at certain points, some things trigger the breaking of that symmetry, right? Leading to either or aspects coming to the fore, that is something that has been spoken about by this, class of model, so to say. Now, Eddington, who's been a very interesting person within the world of science and and beyond as well, sought to understand things in terms of a spiritual world, right? Free from this kind of distinction altogether, in a very Vedantin manner, if you will. But again, that also has a certain degree of caution that we have to kind of, take that with, right? So Bohm and Hailey, on the other hand, talked about explicit and implicate order, right? Where there are certain kinds of implicate ways in which psychophysical, they talk about this word called psychophysical, neutral implicate order can unfold, leading to this mental and the physical state, so to say, right? Now, so this does kind of operate in the realm of panpsychism, but it is, again, very speculative. Even the Pauly-Zhang conjecture that, again, talks about this dual aspect monist view and how the mind and matter are aspects of the same psychophysical neutral reality, the PPN reality, as it will. This also draws on things like, complementarity, non-locality, and so on and so forth. It has its own archetypes, right? It has its own kind of ways to discuss about what orders things in the first place, right? What manifests things in the first place. And these archetypes are more of holistic archetypes. They are not conceived in terms of elements or specific processes for that matter, but in terms of a more holistic side of things, essentially, right? And so the mental states do have, this personal, conscious, unconscious kind of side of things. And, this Pauly-Zhang conjecture also talks about synchronicity, right? This concept of synchronicity, how acausal connections can be had between these various elements, so to say. Right? Now, in all of this, the concept of meaning is very important. What is meaning? What is semantics? Because we started off with that in the first place, right? So Zhang looked at synchronicity as an acausal connecting principle, right? That complements causality in terms of understanding what is happening in the universe and so on and so forth, right? Atman, Spacker, and Falk, because Atman, Spacker, and Filk were the ones who had given about the Zeno effect within bistable perception. I had mentioned in the last slide, but Atman, Spacker himself has been a pioneer in this area, and with Falk, he had kind of tried to understand whether there is a comprehensive taxonomy of how mind and matter correlate, right? Whether they correlate and how they correlate, and also looking at these things called exceptional experiences, right? When we have a model, let's say the PPN model or one of the other models that we have discussed, what are the anomalies, what are the outliers, and how can we, talk about that when we're talking about these psychophysical neutral elements and the aspects thereof, right? And so, again, synchronicity, of course, has been a subject of great work and, research as well. And 70% of therapists, for instance, I think in the US or in across the world, had found that synchronicity experiences are useful in therapy, for instance, and so on and so forth, right? Now, this concept of synchronicity, the concept of semantics, and the concept of dual aspect models has been very much a part of current discussion and frontier research, but we still are, in a fairly speculative domain in certain aspects of these theories themselves, right? So now, if I were to go from the scientific side of things, I actually have a couple of other slides, but I don't think I will be going over them right now. They're talking about contextuality, right? How brain activities are, of course, inherently contextual, and they have to be regarded in terms of that. So how do we even talk about probabilities? Because quantum physics does talk about probabilities. So if we were to talk about contextuality, then we have to talk about probabilities in terms of conditional probabilities, right? Probabilities that are dependent on existing scenarios or situations or the context in which they exist in the first place, right? So because of that, there are people like Khrennikov, and I'll just that, just one moment. Yeah, so Krennikov's contextual measurement model talks about probabilities in terms of conditional aspects, and he has kind of tried to look at measurement in a more contextual manner and then explained the brain side of things with that, right? So we are going beyond the von Neumann, the usual kind of way of talking about quantum systems, and looking at this contextual aspect in a very embedded manner, so to say. Right now, if I were to now go into the index side of things, which is very important, I think this whole concept of the hard problem, I mean, would not be quite all that hard if you were to go by the internal formulations of these theories in the first place, right? So, for instance, Advaita Vedanta, we talk about Atman and Brahman as pure consciousness. Sankhya also talks about consciousness, although in a more dualistic manner, and how Purusha or this consciousness aspect comes forth. Now, this hard problem is probably a dichotomy which is false, right? If you talk about things from the index side of things, because we don't talk about consciousness as a product of the brain in the first place, right? We talk about consciousness as a much more fundamental unified reality, which can be understood in terms of, there are various modes of accessing it, and there are terms here which, of course, will be is not quite scientifically kind of provable or has not been looked at all that much. Terms like, for instance, the grace of the fundamental reality, right? So if you were to talk about that to a physicist, they would say, what do you even mean by the grace of a fundamental reality, right? But in the index side of things, within the Shaiva, perspective, for instance, in the Shiva Strotavali, they talk about, this Sanskrit shloka, which talks about na dhyayato na japatah swadhasya vidhi purvakam evamev Shiva Bhasastam Numo Bhakti Shalinam, right? Where bhakti is talked about as a mode, as a valid mode, to approach that fundamental reality, so to say. And in fact, the rational modes of accessing it are often spoken about as not being sufficient to actually approach that reality as such, right? So, which is a very interesting kind of commentary, which is a very interesting intervention that is put forth by the index side of things, so to say. Now, philosophers such as Acharya Nagarjuna, right? They talk about consciousness being empty of inherent existence, which also has to be qualified because there are many different strands of the Madhyamaka school and the Advaitin or the Vedantin spectrum that we have. And so whether we should take that at face value is a question that should be asked, right? Because if you talk about even the Buddha, right, even Buddha, he never quite spoke about the fact that there is no such reality per se. And that is a common misconception that people have had and have nurtured over time. Because if you see the history of Buddhism, there was a school of thought which was called the Sarvastavadin school of thought, right? And there is the Shunyavadin school of thought which is prevalent at the moment. Now, the point is that Buddha, there's a very famous story, right, where somebody comes up to him and they say that, well, is God there, right? And so Buddha just smiles, right? And in the same evening, somebody comes and says, does God not exist, essentially? And Buddha still smiles, right? So he doesn't quite state it in the way that people often, say that he did. And therefore, one has to be very careful in terms of how we approach this question of the fundamental reality in the Indic perspective. Even in Advaita Vedanta, we talk about aparusya, but also we talk about something known as anirvachaniya. Anirvachaniya means that you cannot articulate it, you cannot model it, right? That fundamental reality. So the whole statement of proposing it or negating it does not even come into the picture, right? Because if you were to articulate it, then there is always something which you do not articulate, which by definition is a negation of whatever you have articulated. And by definition, that is not part of your articulation. And if we say that Brahman is the fundamental reality, then logically you are in a trap, right? You are actually preempting the possibility of having the negated aspects within your formulation as such, right? So in the first place, you cannot articulate it. And that has been a very fundamental aspect of Vedantin thought and various other schools of thought as well. Now, in Kashmiri Shaiva Darshan, which is Kashmiri Shaivism, again, we talk about the non-dual reality, but they talk about it in terms of Shiva, right? Lord Shiva. And there in the Ishvara Pratyabhigna Karika, there are various ways in which, again, the spiritual realization aspect has been spoken about. Kartari, Gyatari, Swatmanya Adi Siddhe Maheshwari Ajratma, Nishedham Va Siddhim Va Vididakaha, right? Which is basically talking about Ajaratma, which is Ajar. Ajar means which is inanimate, which doesn't have, the sentient aspect per se. And within that, right, what is the way in which one looks at the reality in that way, right? Does Gyan or Kartari means the the karmic aspect, right? Does that help us in that way? It doesn't quite, right? There is a certain direct realization that various Kashmiri Shaivite schools of thought talk about, especially the Pratyabhigya school of thought, which says that that realization is almost like a eureka moment, right? It's fairly non-linear and fairly abrupt in its own way at times. It's very magical in that sense, and it's very interesting. Kind of some treatises talk about it at great length, which can be looked at, and one of them is the Ishvara Pratyabhigya Karika, which is a seminal text in Kashmiri Shaivism. Now, there are many different areas of consciousness theory today which talk about things like philosophical zombies, right? If you were to have all the elements of the human mind and the body put into a certain kind of automata, if you will, right? Does that kind of lead to a philosophical premise or a philosophical capability of certain kinds, right? Is it a zombie? Is it more than just that, right? So now, how does the Indic thought can it reconcile this idea, right? So before we go into that, we have to understand that subjective experiences themselves, this concept of subjectivity itself has a certain degree of conditioning, right? We have to understand that it is qualified, and even when objective reality is shared, there is a certain degree of qualification while doing so, right? So Vasubandhu's Abhidharma Kosha, for instance, talks about how perception is, shaped by individual karma, right? About the impressions, the karmic impression that one has. In Trika Shaiva Darshan, we talk about mala, which is the impurities or the veils, vasanas, which are latent impressions of each person, so to say. So in the Pratyabhigya Hridayam by Acharya Kshemaraja, he talks about how the differentiation between objects and that which can be known or experiencing it, each adapted to its own kind of scheme of things or the way in which it is predisposed, if you will, right? And that obviously is related to this concept of vasanas, the latent impressions, the latent aspects of one's own personality, if you will, or one's own stage of spiritual development, if you will. And that has to be understood in terms of that. Again, context comes into the picture and how we talk about conditioning, so to say. Now, in Trika Shaivism, Kashmiri Shaivism, we talk about reality in terms of 36 tattvas, starting from Paramashiva, which is the fundamental reality, so to say, right up to inert matter and going beyond. And the concept of Vidya or Vimarsha, the idea of self-reflective awareness, is very much important, as it is in Advaita Vedanta as well. So the concept that entities might function in the lower tattvas, where there is not quite pure reflective, self-reflective awareness, is also allowed, right? At least in Kashmiri Shaivism and even otherwise as well, right? In Vedanta as well. So it may appear to be conscious without being truly self-aware in that sense. So thereby kind of talking about philosophical zombies or the concept of consciousness, even within that which may seem to be not sentient for that matter, right? Which is ajar in that sense, right? So even for that, there is a certain degree, a qualified degree of consciousness that has been proposed within the Kashmiri Shaiva school of thought and in Advaita Vedanta also for that matter. Now, there's a very fascinating concept which is called as Spanda, which has been very important within the Shaiva school of thought, which is basically this dynamic and creative force, right? In certain places, it's talked about in terms of pulsation of consciousness, if you will, right? And in the Spanda Karika of Acharya Vasugupta, the entire universe is talked about in terms of this pulsation, and understanding that can help us in getting, one or in union with that eternal self that Vasugupta and various other people in the Kashmiri Shaiva school of thought have spoken about, right? So here, the shloka is very interesting. Yasya jagati spandati chetana murtihi sa devtanam vibhurrachate spandaha tam gyatva spanditu manaha vidyamana brahmatma bhavam pravillapya sarvada, right? So basically this concept that there is a pravillapya as in it is prevalent everywhere in a certain manner. Now, very interesting, devtanam vibhurrachate spandaha. That means that even at the level of devtas or at the level where we're talking about qualified existence in some way, even there it is very much inherent, it is very much present, and it is, however, qualified in a certain manner of speaking, right? So one has to kind of look beyond that and attune oneself with that fundamental reality that has been spoken about. Now, there is a very interesting kind of commentary that was given in the 9th century text, Netra Tantra, where, I've often heard this thing that does Kashmiri Shaivism say the same things as the Upanishads and as the Advaita Vedanta school of thought. I have always been one for a unified perspective in looking at these things, right? And I think this whole idea of having these schools of thought as disparate and isolated is itself a kind of false premise as I see it. And so in that, to that kind of, in that direction, I would like to propose this one topic, one kind of point, which is that this commentary by Acharya Kshemaraja talks about Spanda in the context of Pranava. Pranava is Om, as we talk about it. Om, the fundamental kind of reality in the Upanishadic school of thought, and there is a very direct kind of correlation that is being kind of established within this commentary, which I think is very important in today's context, right? Because these are not talking about different things beyond a point. Of course, the manifestation, the modes, or even the pramana, right? The pramana, the ways of establishing it may be different in a different darshan, but at the end of the day, we are talking about a unified dharmic perspective, a unified way to look at it from the adhyatmic as well as other ways of approaching it in that sense, right? So we have to be a little careful in that as well, and I would like to highlight that here. Now, transcending dualism, that is very, very important, and in this, the Shiva Sutra talks about pure consciousness. However, what is very interesting in the Indic school of thought is that it's not all treatises and just commentaries, right? It is always often in terms of poetry, for instance, right? And in that, in that direction, I would like to highlight the works of Laleshwari ji, right? Who's also called as Lal Ded. She was a Kashmiri mystic who wrote beautiful vatsuns or vaks, which are these poetic style kind of compositions, where she gives very profound things. I mean that comes from a philosophical perspective or from a spiritual perspective in a very, very simple way, right? And so she speaks about whatever work I did became the worship of God. Whatever word I uttered became a prayer. Whatever this body of mine experienced becomes a sadhana of Shaiva Tantra, illumining my path to Paramashiva, right? And this was beautifully made into a poetic form. In fact, there is a very well-known song that people nowadays sing, which even has been used in some of the movies recently in Bollywood as well, which is called as Hocus Pocus, right? Some of you may have heard about this song. In fact, Hocus Pocus has a very Shaiva kind of, or if you will, a certain kind of Advaitin perspective to it, right? Where it is questioning what are you and what am I, right? When there is one greater reality, if you will, right? So somewhere we have lost that inherent mooring of what these things actually meant, although it still quite survives within the cultural context and the social context, so to say, right? In the same way, Karaikal Amayar also kind of spoke about the Shaiva Siddhanta in terms of her poetic renditions as well, and the unification perspective thereof as well, and talking about non-duality, so to say. So Abhinav Gupta, he talks about it in a slightly very interesting way. Abhinav Gupta ji is one of the pioneers of Kashmiri Shaiva Darshan as well. Paramartha Sar is one of his works, and there are various others as well. And he was a very fascinating person in Indic wisdom, for that matter, because he unified a lot of different disparate strands. For instance, he talked about rasa theory, the theory of aesthetics, the theory of rasa, in terms of the non-dual aspects, in terms of Shiva as well, right? So he was somebody who could actually kind of, dabble in and connect various disparate, streams of thought and ideas, essentially, right? So in this particular shloka, which has come from Paramartha Sara, shlok number 6, he says, Nana vidvarnanam rupam dhate yatha malaha svatika. Svatika is basically the crystal, this concept of a crystal, right? So everything that we see, the various forms, the gods, the humans, the animals, the trees, right? Sur manush pashupada paru patvam tadva dishopi is basically talking about this aspect that sur, manush, pashu, right? All of these are various forms of which are coming from this, which are different colors, if you will, which are being reflected by this pure crystal, which is Fatikaha, right? In the Swatantriya Sutra Vritti, again, this concept of expansion of self-awareness is spoken about in aphorism 8, for instance, and thereafter in Ishvara Pratyabhigna Karika, again, this idea of the unified whole is looked at, right? So there are many different such further works. Now, there is the interesting thing that Abhinav Gupta ji was also very interesting in terms of the methods he's talked about, right? So we often speak about the shamanic schools of thought where we talk about renunciation, where we talk about, having a certain degree of abandonment, if you will, of certain things. Whereas in his approach, he never quite said that, right? He said, do not abandon anything, do not accept anything, right? But just pause and abide, right? Pause and abide in one's own self, if you will, right? So it's a very interesting way in which Abhinav Gupta, he talks about Sambhava Upaya, which is basically this concept of concentrating on Shambhu or Shiva, or your own reality, if you will, right? Fundamental reality, and not quite doing anything dramatic, essentially, for getting there, right? Not only does he say that, he also says that the idea of the truth, the fundamental reality, is beyond opposites, right? And this is a concept that that even within quantum physics or within, science in general, we have had a number of different places where paradoxes, where things that are not reconcilable from the rational perspective have come forth, right? So in this particular text, for instance, in Ishvara Pratyabhigna Karika, there is a certain place where he says that even if there is a word I would like to highlight here, which is viruddha bhava sansparshe, right? Where there is a viruddha bhava, right? Where there is a contradiction of sorts, right? The ultimate reality is untouched by these contradictions also, right? So it is going beyond these opposites and therefore very much able to reconcile that within its very fold as well, right? So that is a very interesting perspective, especially coming from a metaphysical or a philosophical or even a scientific perspective to an extent. Of course, in my book as well, I've highlighted that doing that one-to-one joining of dots has to be really not done, essentially, and has to be looked at more in terms of resonances rather than direct translations from one to the other, so to say, right? Now, there are a couple of slides I have on some of these proponents of Indic wisdom. One is Acharya Vijnana Bhikshu. He also talks about this, but his theory is called Avibhaga Advaita Vedanta, where he says that, again, Chit and Prakriti, the consciousness and mind matter aspect. Now, very interesting. He talks about mind matter as part of Prakriti and Chit as something totally different, which, again, the Upanishads also talk about, because we have been only dealing with mind matter duality, right, and non-duality. But here we're talking about something categorically different, essentially, right? And that is something we have to be very clear about, right? So he says that they are ontologically distinct, but inseparable in their own ways, because they have this concept of adhyasa, which is superimposition of the two and the way in which they interact and work together, right? And so, again, he also talks about Pratibimbavada, which is basically that the individualized self is a reflection of the universal Chit, so to say, right? Now, Chit, again, for him as well, he says that it is obviously, if we read it very carefully, it's non-algorithmic, it's obviously non-computational, and it's not quite even knowable for that matter, right? So it is it's nirvikalpaka, right? And it cannot be generated, it cannot be, looked at in terms of antahakaran, the operations of the mind or the intellect, the buddhi, even for that matter, right? So Ishvara Gita Bhashyam, he talks about that, right? And that only and only that reality itself can reveal itself to anything that is trying to approach it, right? So again, this concept of grace, if you will, and so there is no way in which computationally or algorithmically, right, if you were to talk about this in terms of consciousness, right, is just not approachable in that way if you were to go with Acharya Vijnana Bhikshu's expansion on that front, right? And so Chit is not an object of pramana in that sense, right? It is a precondition for all epistemic acts, right? Everything that is knowledgeable, that is understandable, it is a precondition of that, right? And in a different context, these treatises also talk about it in terms of space-time, right, and causality, something that pre-exists from that as well, right? So if it were to pre-exist from that, how would you even formulate it? How would you construct it in terms of those, right? If you were to say that I want to explain Chit in terms of causality, in terms of space-time, in terms of the physicalist world as we see it, well, it cannot be done fundamentally because by design, we're talking about something derivative explaining something which is more primal, right? And so there is a certain fundamental, anomaly there, or a kind of, fundamental difficulty that exists because of that, right? So then we talk about Acharya Jiva Goswami. I mean, I have mentioned him here because we had spoken about Bhakti Shalinam in one of the shloka. And so this concept of, again, grace of bhakti, right, which people often, laugh off essentially as something which is not quite important, but it very much is, because at some level, the idea that has been proposed by Acharya Jiva Goswami as well is that there are no other ways in which to approach that, right? I mean, because the Paramatman is the Nimitta Karana, the conscious agent of that creation, right? And it is with that participatory aspect of that reality, and only by that we can understand it or experience it in its entirety in that way, right? So Acharya Jiva Goswami talks about the highest form of bhakti is basically the cultivation of service to. He is a Vaishnav, proponent, of course, and so he talks about in terms of Krishna worship, Sri Krishna, and how the pursuit of knowledge or fruitive work is also important. However, he qualifies that it's not just by that, but you also have to develop yourself to to accept whatever is given to you from that reality, if you will, right? So that is very important. There are a few other works I wouldn't want to kind of, because I'm more interested in the discussions, going forward. So Siddhant Sangraha is a work that kind of brings together many disparate strands of Bharatiya Gyan Darshan. But however, this concept of luminosity, how do these things become evident? How do they become, visible to us, right? So there is something known as Swarupa Bhuta Jnana, which is basically the intrinsic self-luminosity, right? Or in a Upanishadic context, it's talked about in terms of Swaprakasha, right? Swaprakashatva, which is that it is luminous in its own way, and that is how consciousness in its purest form is, right? But however, when we're talking about Atman, when you talk about the Jiva, right, there is something known as Dharma Bhuta Jnana, which is basically a function, a dharmic aspect of the Atman, right, which is the cognitive capacity. So the interesting thing here is that there is a qualification of these different aspects of how the luminosity or how the evidential aspect comes forth, right, and how we can access it in the first place, right? So the object relatedness works in two different ways, or in a few different ways, right? One is that you can have a direct kind of contact with it in a certain manner speaking. Yeah, anyway, so I'll kind of move forward. So you can either access it directly, or there are certain ways in which inferentially you can kind of understand it. But even in that, there is a certain degree to which you can go up to, and not after that, right? So there are many treatises that talk about this and the fundamental barrier that we face thereof. Now, Udayanacharya, I've been very interested in as a person who has as a luminary who has worked on the Nyaya Parampara, and one of my works in the IKS side has been on talking about rational theology, right? We're talking about how Ishvara or Isha can be spoken of in terms of, if at all, in terms of things we see in the physicalist side of reality, so to say, right? So in this as well, he defends a thought that consciousness, however, in Nyaya, that consciousness is not quite an independent substance, right? It has a certain substrate aspect, but it is not quite an independent substance. The reason I've mentioned this here is that there are many different ways in which of knowing, or this the self-revelation aspect is not brought in per se, right? So again, the qualified way to approach knowledge of cognition and of understanding of the self or the reality, so to say, has been beautifully mentioned in Udayanacharya's Atma Tattva Viveka as well. And I feel that should be recognized in its own right as such. Now, so I was asked kind of how does it relate to this concept of leadership, of course, because we are in the Partha Ghosh School of Leadership as it stands, and so the whole idea which both the scientific side as well as the IKS side brings forth is that there is a certain importance of correlative side of things, right? Number one. And number two, there is also the reflexive aspect, right? Reflexive means something which can self-register, self-understand, and work with that, right? So we know that there is a certain discourse that, is very much prevalent in today's world, which is highly localized. It is kind of, of individual kind of awareness, right? And however, that is very, very localized and very, very parochial as well in certain ways, right? One important thing thereof is that we all believe in absolutes, right? We know and they don't, right? For instance, and that has been the root cause of polarization, if you will. And this arrogance has led to a lot of strife and conflict, right? Now, there is a requirement to kind of move beyond that towards a more non-dual, towards a more, interconnected or a dynamic collective, if you will, which should be the premise of going forward in that way, right? So by synthesizing these concepts of quantum non-locality, right? And this concept of contextuality in the way we understand things, right? And that whatever is happening is actually possibly, if you go by the IKS side of things, is part of this primordial universal vibration, right? Then this whole idea of I-ness, right? I-ness in a very parochial sense goes out of the window, of course, right? And so we move away from this classical view of the human mind as isolated towards this non-dual model. And we have an actionable methodology as well, because I often hear that, how do we kind of talk about things which are, so abstract, right? This is very abstract. This is all philosophy. How does it matter, right? I mean, it does matter, because at the end of the day, I always believe that metaphysics and the philosophy of the age or of the people guides various things on the political, the geopolitical, the social side of things, right? A very simple example would be that of the parliament of let's say, the UK and India, for that matter, right? I mean, I've always found the template or the way in which the structuring has been done of these two systems or these two kind of bodies, right, as very reflective of the philosophies thereof, right? Because if you look at the the House of Commons or the House of Lords, for that matter, there is a certain way in which you have the treasury benches and the opposition, right, which are sitting right in front of each other, right, and in a very, very confrontational manner, if you will, right? And whereas in India, we have had a more circular kind of system of doing things, right? We have the parliament itself is composed in a semicircular manner. And so you have a spectrum, right? You don't have quite a binary, right? You have more of a spectrum. And that is exactly what has been spoken about in terms of the metaphysics of our civilization, right? In Vedanta itself, people often mistake that Vedanta is only about Dvait and Advait, right? But no, not quite, right? Because there are so many other, there is, Vishishta Advaita, there is, Achintya Bheda Bheda, aspect of things. In Sri Ramakrishna Paramhansa's case, we talk about the Vijnana Vedanta aspect of things, right? So it is never quite a monolith. It is never quite a very kind of absolutist aspect of looking at this, right? So we have to understand that metaphysics and the way we perceive the universe and the reality of the society is very much going to go forward in terms of defining the topology, the methodology as well, right, of how we look at altruistic leadership, right? Because I often feel that we talk about it in terms of just a charity case, right? We are doing altruistic leadership, but that's not enough, right? We have to do it from a certain sense of realization of why we are doing it in the first place and relating to it at a very, very kind of fundamental level as well, right? So that is something that I would really like to kind of put forth, that this is more of what I call as Swatma Nishtha, right? Which is basically spiritual alignment with oneself in the greater scheme of things in a more broader context. And from that space, we have to kind of look at whatever we are looking at, essentially, right? So this atomized myth, this atom of reality has to be kind of got rid of in a certain manner, right? And interactions within such an atomized myth model are fairly transactional at various ways, and it leads to collisions, of course, because you have friction that is very much inherent in that, right? So if you were to look at it in terms of contextuality and correlations, right, in terms of, well, if you will, non-Kolmogorian contextuality, right, and the Indic knowledge systems side of things as well, how these empathetic correlations can kind of arise, right? Again, to relate it to quantum entanglement is a bit of a stretch, but one can talk about resonances of how things arise from correlations, right? This concept of emergence that comes where qualitatively new phenomena arise because of the aspect of correlations between systems, right? Which were not present at the more, the lower levels of those phenomena for that matter, right? So there is something creative, inherently creative, which also the Kashmiri Shaiva and the Advait Vedanta school of thought talks about, right? They say that when you have this kind of correlations and when you have the understanding that reality is very much correlative in its very nature, right? That is when you ultimately become creative. Yeah. So again, the avibhaga aspect. So I have already kind of discussed most of this. So again, the one thing that I would like to propose is the conceptualization of the non-dual leader. Right, somebody who has this ability to talk about non-algorithmics, the edge, if you will, the self-reflective aspect that I've spoken about, right, and this deliberate expansion of one's individualized awareness, right? Again, when we talk about the current, government, for instance, and Prime Minister Narendra Modi, he doesn't quite kind of talk about it in terms of, having just himself as a leader. He used the word Pradhan Sevak, which is more of, trying to serve rather than trying to rule, essentially, right? So the altruistic leadership is not quite a top-down authoritarian command and control kind of model at all. It is more of, a phase-locked, coherent, stabilization, if you will, right? Where you are relating very fundamentally with that reality and working towards developing a synergy, a harmony within that, right? So that is what I think is very important to understand as we go forward. And this proposition of a non-dual leader, right, which is what I would like to highlight here, right? So I would like to quickly go forward. The elephant in the room again is that what is consciousness, if it is computable or not, right? And if you were to have such a science possible in the first place, is that even possible in itself? I've mentioned there are many problems on that front, right? In fact, Swami Vivekananda had mentioned that maybe the mathematical world will take about 1,000 years to come to the point where we can talk about the category where we're talking about Brahman and all that, right? Which is we are not there yet, right? So we have to be a little careful on that. And but however, there are some traits, there are some aspects which are very evident, both in terms of consciousness and in the broader universe, both in the physicalist sense and beyond, which we have to understand, which we have to relate to. And in that contextuality, open systems, non-locality. There are various aspects of that do matter essentially, right? So I would quickly like to highlight these books, which I think have already been mentioned about. The recent one, The Universe is Pranking Us, has just come in. And I would like to acknowledge a few bodies here. I have been very closely associated with the Sri Kanchi Kamakoti Peetham. I myself have taken Diksha in the Sri Ramakrishna Mission in London in 2019. And I'm closely associated with Mata Amritananda Math because I'm part of Amritananda University, Amrita University, and also have closely, in a spiritual way also associated. And in terms of the academic side, NIAS, of course, Amrita as it stands, Cambridge, Harvard, IISc and MIT are the primary ones that have led to various discussions and understandings of the foundations of science and interactions with metaphysics. And Mandala is one area of Vigyan Bharati, which talks about the epistemic and ontological resonances between the Indian perspective and modern science. And I happen to be the national convener of that as it stands. And there are a few other bodies as well, which we has been working in that side, right? So I would like to keep it to that. And thank you for being patiently hearing me. And I would look forward to the discussions and questions. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Dr. Guha Majumdar. I think, very frankly speaking, very frankly speaking, I mean, your speech was like having a lot of food at the same time, Yeah. So the service on the table, yeah, I mean, we don't have a good liver system, neither we have a good digestion system. Our enzymes are not working well. I think our circadian rhythms are out of shape, and yet you're serving us a lot of food on the table. But I think more than that, and a lot of good food, not only good food, extremely rich food of the highest kind. And then all of that coming to leadership. What I liked about this speech, and I think Dr. Ghosh will agree, you represent the youth of India. And I am so happy that the youth of India is doing things which Swamiji and Sri Aurobindo and others wanted them to do. So the national resurrection, which great saints like Swamiji, Sri Aurobindo and Ramana Maharshi and Anandamoyi Ma and others initiated, Vijay Krishna Goswami, Prabhupada, many others initiated, is life. It's happening. And you represent that liveliness. I like the richness, the repertoire, the vastness, and also the depth. And I like to be very sharp here because we have a paucity of time, and I'll ask Professor Prasanta Kumar Datta to ask one or two questions. I was very surprised that you really embarked on Kashmiri Shaivism, especially the works of Abhinava Gupta, Utpala Gupta, Khemraj, and especially the whole lineage of Muktananda, Nityananda in the West, right. which is the Tao of Physics, Fritjof Capra and others. So all that is not dead. And the India of the ages is not dead. It is alive, right, as Sri Aurobindo says. So you represent that very well, and you're very rich. Your fundamentals are very clear. I don't want to get into that. Let's have some questions and answers. Yeah. So Professor Datta, if you're around, Professor Datta is the head, former head. Excellent. And Professor Datta told me that this is a subject I don't know much about, but I know he knows a lot about this. So Professor Datta, make it you bolo. Tell something.
Yeah, it was very nice, excellent talk. And I was listening with a lot of curiosity without any background knowledge. So really, it is very nice. Let me ask few questions. Just these are not questions, this is just curiosity. As a student, I am asking. Say, Vivekananda used to get information in his consciousness. If there is any calamity occurring somewhere else, he used to get perturbed. So how do you explain it in terms of non-locality of quantum mechanics?
Right. I think that's a very good question because, not only that, I mean, even some people have proposed that this idea that something can manifest, right, in a certain different context, in terms of the state of the system, we talk about reincarnation and the idea of manifestations in that sense, whether that also can be connected to quantum physics because we talk about teleportation and so on and so forth. Now, we have to be a little careful there because of two reasons. One is that we are talking about when Swami Vivekananda's, work words when we're talking about that. It's more in terms of the spiritual aspect, right? And we're working in the realm of spirituality there, right? So whether the spirituality translates as is into the physicalist world is a question that still we are engaging and dealing with, right? So whether that non-locality in the first realm is the non-locality or has a very strong kind of correlation with the non-locality in the other is something that I've also kind of engaged with and discussed at great length, right? The second thing is that we are talking about human beings, we're talking about elements of us, right? And we are macroscopic systems, we are not quite quantum systems in that way. So if you were to propose that this is because of quantum effects or non-classical effects on the physicalist side, there has to be a carrier of that effect also, right? Which still is in the speculative domain, right? So one can definitely say that there are resonances, right, which we can talk about, which we can explore. But saying that it is
mother comes to know about the health of his son far away.
Yeah, I know. I have
Yes. Similar type of thing.
Yes.
And there's a whole issue. A very interesting discussion. There's a whole issue of, on the one point we are talking about transmigration and reincarnation, which is like one soul from one body to the next body, which is like a vertical axis over time. On the other hand, we are talking about connecting across various souls, across space, which is the horizontal axis, which is the other way, which is the other way. Yeah. So we are bringing in two axes on at one point.
The axis,
Dr. Ghosh will probably love this. This is too much of an imagination, Yeah. So you're imagining on an individual axis from the past to the future, and at present you're connecting at present with all of us at present to be on the planes of empathy. That's leadership. So you know what you are across time individually, and you also know everybody at time t horizontally. This is absolutely, whether you call it spirituality or quantum physics, I think these are just terms. What I simply feel, these are clarities which has been given by our Indian sages for over a long time. And as you said, I think Tesla said that to Swamiji. I'll develop the right mathematics and the right physics to express what you're trying to explain me, force and matter and prana and akasha. That debate is, akashic fields and prana as the vital. That debate is still going on. And you mentioned David Bohm, his two orders, explicate and the implicate orders. So I think there is some progress, but we really need a little more clarity. Prashanto, one more question.
My second question is that related to, you told that AI has some sort of consciousness maybe there in AI. So in that case, consciousness and life, is there any, so there will be conflict, no? Say AI has no life, but is there any relationship between life and consciousness? I can give a life to a molecule, but I cannot give life to a consciousness to a molecule.
Right. So this is a very rich question, and I would like to address it from two or three sides. Firstly, I didn't quite mention that AI has consciousness. I left it as a question. I left it as a proposition or a point to you reflect on, right? And I think our Vedic sages also, which is something we should emulate again in past part of leadership, is that not everything needs to be pinned down to the last mile, because some things are possibly not be able to be pinned down in the first place. For instance, in Nasadya Sukta, we talk about this idea that if the devtas know, or even maybe they do not, right? So they just leave it at that, right? So again, I didn't quite mention that. Now the question that it kind of begs is, what is consciousness then, right? And that is the whole discussion that we have been having at the moment. Now I didn't mention a few theories. One is the integrated information theory, which is by Tononi. And there is a global workspace theory, which has also been mentioned in various contexts. Now, what we have in quantum physics today is not quite the quantum physics of 1950s and 60s, where Wheeler mentioned about consciousness in the human context, and that is what led to agency and so on and so forth, right? We have quite more or less got rid of that side of things, in the general parlance and the conventional way of looking at quantum physics. So we now talk about decoherence, right? We talk about ways in which the interactions affect things, right? Now, I don't see that as a loss, right? Because I don't see that as a loss because maybe our very definition of consciousness itself was very human-centered and brain-centered in the first place, right? Which is not what we had from the Indic perspective, right? We had something which was more in terms of that correlative aspect that I was talking about, right? So the correlations between system and environment, system and other systems, and so on and so forth, right? That also is very much a part of that inherent consciousness from a more non-dual perspective, mind-matter perspective, if you will. Right. So I think that if you talk about the idea of life and sentience, right? While at Harvard, I was interacting with a group there, which is working on trying to use chemical reactions to replicate or create life. Right. I mean, there are some symptoms of life. I mean, locomotion, evolutionary aspect, reproduction, and so on and so forth. And simple self-reinforcing chemical reactions, can they actually create life, if you will? Right. Now, the question again goes back to the point that just by replicating the algorithmic steps or the characteristics or the tendencies, right, does that represent the thing in itself to the last mile is a question. Right. Again, going back to the point that, if I were to explain everything, the characteristics of an object, am I actually talking about the objectness of that object as well? Right? Am I actually going the last mile in that sense? So when we say that life is is kind of recreated, right? We are probably recreating some tendencies, some lakshanas, if you will, right? Some aspects of it, right? But the question of and the claim that we are replicating life itself is, I think, a bit of a stretch, right? Because the whole definition of life or the whole definition of consciousness is still very much unknown, if you will, and has to be qualified quite a bit before we make such statements. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely, Professor Majumdar, is that I think science till date is trying to replicate and answer the process. I mean, of how. I mean, answering how, but it has never fundamentally gone to the question of why there is a consciousness. That's right. Point number one. Yeah, I think, and I think so far all the research on consciousness till date has been restricted to the brain. But if we go back to Upanishads, much more than the brain, the Upanishad has talked about the heart as the seat of consciousness. The brain is just a process center. I think that point is yet to be taken up by Western sciences, yet to be taken up by. Yeah, I think before we go to Onupam, Prasanta, any one?
Last question is, if you saw that in Feynman's, I think lecture, third lecture, he talked about that interference with single photon. Right. Okay, interference with single photon in a double slit. And at the end, he told that a day will come, people will find that a photon has a consciousness.
Right. Yes. So I see, for even photon, electrons also, right? If there is one electron, right? The whole idea of interference, the same double slit experiment for that, which Hitachi had done a few years back, right? How does that happen in the first place? So the wave particle duality aspect and so on, right? So there are some questions that very much remain. But if you will reconcile that within this idea, which even Abhinav Gupta had mentioned, that some paradoxical or contradictory aspects are part of that greater reality, if you will, right? Even in the physicalist sense of things, then I think it's much more easier to reconcile it, right? The problem we face is because we resist certain kinds of conceptual leaps, right? I always say that Einstein, he did seminally, very, very important things, but the mathematics of it and even the physical premise of it was developed in the previous 50 years, right? And even Max Planck went very close to kind of, postulating the fact that photons are what they are, right? But he stopped at the fact that emitters are what actually generate this discreteness, whereas Einstein said, well, nothing doing with emitters, the thing itself is quantized or is discrete in its nature, in its properties, right? So the concept leap, right, is something which we are somewhere, I feel, resisting, from going forth with, essentially. Yeah.
I don't want to expand this point and make it more complicated, but I think besides these names like Niels Bohr, Albert Einstein, and later Richard Feynman, I think there was one person who started it all. That's Maxwell. That's Maxwell.
Right.
And I think Maxwell's equations on the governors, which led to Norbert Wiener at MIT to arrive at the feedbacks and the loops with von Neumann and Claude Shannon, and the whole birth of information sciences. That is the point. And I think accidentally or knowingly, I don't know, Norbert Wiener once committed that if a system can send a signal which can feed back to its own system and get a loop back to send the next signal, then somehow we can say the system is self-autonomous or conscious.
Yeah.
But he didn't work on that much. But he said that. He said that.
Yeah.
And I read his. He was working on Maxwell.
Right. So for instance, now we also entanglement. It's not only non-local in the spatial sense. We also talk about temporal entanglement, right, where things are connected across time, right? So I mean, if your description kind of brought to mind this aspect that it doesn't have to be spatial necessarily, right? There's some certain kinds of crystals, for instance, that have time-based correlations that exist, right?
Yeah.
So
I think we have two questions hanging up in the green button. So one is Anupam, the other is.
I have a last question.
That's great.
Let's move ahead.
Nirvikalpa Samadhi.
Yes.
Say you can subdue the consciousness by anesthesia. So what happens during Nirvikalpa Samadhi? Is it a subdue?
No,
the same thing happens.
Yeah. So that's a very good question, because Nirvikalpa Samadhi, if you will, talk about Sri Ramakrishna Paramahamsa, we say that Nirvikalpa Samadhi, there is even a day given, 21 days, and then the person kind of moves beyond, doesn't kind of come back. Sri Ramakrishna did come back, right, for the welfare of humanity, for that matter, right? So Nirvikalpa Samadhi, I mean, is the final union, if you will, right, with that reality, so to say. So much so that your faculties as well. I was reading about this in one of Osho's work as recently, right, where he says that this whole idea of agency, right, that I am smelling, I am speaking, I am listening, right, all of that, right, when that ceases to be important, right, then that kind of has no relevance anymore, and not just in terms of speaking it, but in terms of actually living it, right? Then you have the final kind of submersion or the immersion into the greater reality that you have, right? So science has not approached that greater reality, and I mean, I don't want to sound like a cynic here or a skeptic here needlessly, but because of that causality and space-time aspect, right, and the fact that these are all derivatives, right, we may never be able to approach that reality from a scientific perspective.
That's right. Yeah. So you have to go to a different plane. Yeah, different
kind of way to access it in the first place.
Yeah.
Right?
So I think two questions. Yeah. And others. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, that was good questions, good and wonderful answers. Anupam.
Wonderful talk. So I have one observation that the artificial intelligence is nothing but a computer program, as far as my understanding. So initially, when we started with a computer program, it used to add two numbers or multiply. Later on, it starts playing chess. So then we started calling that the computer program has become intelligent. But later on, we find that is not the intelligence.
Yeah.
Even today, whatever AI programs we are making, so that are kindly that are trying to use some mathematical formula, mathematical methods, and using some data, training something. Based on that training data, it is trying to predict the pattern, whether the robot will go in this direction, that direction. So it is, but at the ground level, it is a computer program, isn't it?
Right.
So a school of thought is there that we could not make it conscious because we don't know what is consciousness. We could not define that one. So what is your take on this?
Yeah, that's a very good, excellent question. So actually, in Trikashaya Darshan and Advait Vedanta, we speak about Maya, right? This whole idea of qualified existence. And within that, there is a lot of aspects that can still be seemingly appearing or done, essentially, right? Which means that it's not quite the fundamental reality as such, but it can show tendencies. It can kind of, give rise to these, appearances of things, so to say. What you're mentioning, that it's not quite consciousness, it's not quite intelligent, it's just in its own framework, moving around in a certain conceptual space, and giving off signs that seem like intelligence as such, right? So the question of consciousness and whether we know it, and why, because we don't know it, that's why we cannot program it, is kind of a self-negating thing, right? I mean, the more you kind of qualify it, right? There is, if you look at by the Indic perspective, there is always something more than that, because as I said, if it's not conceptual at all, if it is not algorithmic at all, then the very design of it is not possible as such, right? The very, very definition of it or the representation of it is not possible, right? Now, if you go from the scientific perspective, then yes, I mean, we have theories of consciousness, right? And there are ways in which nowadays we talk about explainable AI, for instance. We talk about how AI can be made to be more accountable for what it is using its agency or its direction of, pattern formations and information modeling in, right? Because one big question comes in terms of ethics and in terms of what is the intent, what is the direction of that information processing as well, right? Because there are many unfortunate cases that have happened where people ask a question, right? I mean, youngsters have asked questions, which are, in a suicidal state, for instance, and they have got, answers which have actually led them to, take the final step, right? Which is not something which, intelligence with its more comprehensive understanding of things potentially may have kind of, given forth, right? So there are constraints, and I think this debate is a never-ending debate, right? Because you give me a certain delta X kind of increment, right, in terms of our understanding of consciousness, right? The reflexive aspect will always be able to, as per at least the Indic wisdom, find certain things that still are precluded or preempted from being included in that new added framework as well. Right? And so it keeps on having this back and forth kind of calibration or self-calibration, if you will. And I'm not sure whether we can actually kind of get to representing and wiring consciousness.
I buy what you are saying, and that's why we are failing through our clinical psychology of understanding why students or young people reach a certain breaking point or an inflection point beyond which they don't know whether they are dying or living. So they commit a suicide. So they tip over. And clinical psychology is very poor enough, even today, to understand that inflection point. Why? Because it's just working on the basis of some algorithms and clinical prescriptions which look like algorithms. If you put them on paper, they look like algorithm. You do this, then you do that. After that, you do this. But it's not solving things at the basic. Okay, let's have Dr. Ashish.
One point, Professor Shen. So just to answer Anupam's thing as well, there is this self-reflective loop that comes in, right? When we talk about consciousness in the Indian perspective, for instance, we talk about looking at the meta level of the meta level of the meta level, right? What you're thinking of that, and then you're thinking of that as well, and so on and so forth, right? Now, artificial intelligence, whether it can model that as well, right? And this is purely in terms of logistical aspects, right? I mean, in terms of the resources we have and the capability thereof, right? That also raises a question, right? I mean, even in physics, for instance, there are times when whether we can find a unified theory of the universe, right? If we cannot even access certain parts of the universe for that matter, right? Now, I know that may sound a very skeptical kind of
from the leadership school, we can also say whether we can have a unified definition of leadership. Can we?
Right.
That's a very odd. We need to have diverse definitions of leadership. I think let's get Dr. Ashish Jha and let's have one or two more questions because
thank you very much. Not a doctor.
Yeah, fine. It's all the same. You're doctoring the present situation by raising a question.
Yeah, very fascinating conversation. I just wanted to add 2 points from my side. The idea whether AI has consciousness or not, that question itself becomes little flawed because no one can really claim the possession of consciousness.
Yes.
It simply is. So I think that the science, when it is asking that question, that itself is not the right question.
Right.
The second point that humbly I would like to make, just a related point, is that maybe the better question to ask is, does it have the agency, the intellect, the vivek that human beings have to turn off the processing and just turn itself towards consciousness? If that question can be answered, then consciousness simply is. You don't have to possess it, right?
Yeah.
So that's my thought on this matter. I just wanted to add that humbly.
Beautiful points. I think I'd firstly like to comment on the second one. So Shambhav Upaya, which Abhinav Guptaji mentions, right, and this Eureka movement, this abrupt cessation of of these modifications of the brain, and then just realizing it, being in it, right. That is something even Ramana Maharshi speaks about. That is something which many different proponents and luminaries have spoken about. So the question is, it's almost like a non-linear phase transition, if you will, right, where you are in a state of processing, and then you just cease, and then you just realize or be in, right? So now that is, again, a very speculative question at that. But again, I think the question you mentioned about why we are asking consciousness, right? Again, it goes back to the question of consciousness itself, right? From a neuroscientific perspective, maybe we do not know consciousness, but if you were to talk about it in terms of the broader non-dual aspect, right, in terms of pattern formation, in terms of understanding of things, and in terms of rhythm, in the Indic perspective, we talk about this ordering which happens, right? Maybe we can still engage with the question, if not address it completely. That was my point, right? So I mean, and up to a point, and not after that, of course, right? So that is all I mentioned, and I think I would never state that AI has a certain.
You didn't. You just asked.
You never did that. Yeah, at least in the current state.
Just if you allow me to make one more point, I just wanted to thank you for bringing up this Kashmiri Shaivism, which just sees the Shiva and Shakti in the unified way.
Yeah.
And I believe the way forward for leadership is to look at the Shakti aspect. Don't worry too much about consciousness.
Yeah. We are more worried about the Shiva aspect.
We actually
tend to neglect the Shakti aspect.
Yes, just make it beautiful. Make the work environment beautiful for people, and organization will really flourish. Thank you.
Just because.
Yeah, and as Abhinav Guptaji says,
right, let's move on to the next.
We can just have one more question, and then we come to the end of this beautiful session. Yeah. Anyone else has any other question? Yeah. So I think this can go on. I wish you're there in IIT Kharagpur, and Dr. Guha Majumdar. You're an expert, if I was doing your presentation, I would have just presented it as a literature review, but you made connections, those hidden connections, the hidden bands between level 1 and level 4 and level 2 and level 7. And then we could see things. And there was so much of richness in your reference. But not many people will be able to know and do that, because many of us, even till date, think as the Western and the Eastern models as an either-or perspective. It's this or that. Very few in the world, even today, is able to see those connections between the two worlds. Because of our civilization, the way education has happened, the way we have led education in the last 70 years, say in India. It is just now we are talking about Indian knowledge systems, Indian values, and Indian ethics. Even 10, 15 years back, there were objects to be shunned away. It was like a one-way traffic to the West. It was a one-way traffic, and that traffic was just not physical; it was also psychological. So I think. There is a question. Sandeep Bhatia Saab. Sandeep ji, please. If you unmute.
So, thank you, Professor. I have just one question. How do you explain violence, and what can we do that the human beings who are violent resist from being so?
Okay. So, I mean...
Anandamayma has the answer to that. Joy, Anandamayma.
Anandamayma had a beautiful answer.
Beautiful answer to that, yes. But I mean, so if you were to look at the non-dual aspect again, right? I mean, if you were to identify others as very much a part of yourself, right, and at a certain level of existence, I think you'll be naturally predisposed to not commit violence, essentially, right? And this realization, of course, is not a superficial, realization of sorts. But again, that is a very idealistic answer, right? That is something which not everyone possibly will kind of, look at as possible, even for that matter, beyond a point. So I think that is where leadership again comes in terms of, I mentioned, phase locked, a kind of harmonized existence, right? And that is what true leadership will facilitate. I mean, in terms of checks and balances, in terms of the ways to ensure that. And that is not just punitive. That's not just in terms of penalties or punishment for that matter. That is something much more organic and inherent that has to be brought in, both from education and from general discourse in society as well, that has to be facilitated by the leadership itself. And therefore, the leadership has a big role to play, both in terms of realizing that at their level as much as possible and then reflecting that going forward. Yeah. So I think that would be my answer to that.
Yeah, wonderful. I think all these discussions.
Joy, let me bring.
Yeah, Partha, you sum up, and also you tell us Anandavima's observation.
No, I would basically first, I think, congratulate Mrittunjoy's parents for choosing the name, because today he has proven he has lived up to his name. He has conquered any kind of limit. He has transcended through different states of thinking that exist today in the world, whether Kashmir, thoughts in Kashmir to thoughts in Neil Bohr to Albert Einstein to Shotten Bosch to Ramakrishna. So we traveled a lot in space and time, in thoughts. But let me now challenge a couple of points where I felt there were some contradictions. You began with saying that calculability and the desire to calculate and measure itself is a limit. But there are certain things which cannot be calculated, certain things which cannot be measured, and often the Western science have taken that route, whereas Eastern science has not really depended on calculability, but more understanding the relationships which cannot be measured but important. So I think where we often go wrong, justify that whatever we know about the Eastern methods through the Western eyes, and when we see Niels Bohr is saying certain things which fits in with what our philosophers might have said 7,000 years ago or 5,000 years ago, we feel good. We have to get out of that mode.
Absolutely.
We have to continue to develop on what developed in the Eastern world, in the Eastern shores, and bring it to the reality of today, whether it's artificial intelligence, genetic engineering, space travel, or whatever we are doing today. And then I think we'll receive the breakthrough.
Absolutely.
So that's point number one.
Yeah.
Point number two, I think I took a lot of notes, by the way. I liked the point which came out and which particularly important for leadership, that when you talked about measurement-driven evolution and difference between entanglement and interconnectedness. Now, I think we tend to get, when the point was raised about conflicts and why so much of violence, we live in a world of entanglement. We have moved away from the world of interconnectedness. And I think we have to, in our school of leadership, have to bring out the concept of interconnectedness of the three PIs. We have a model we call, which you have touched on, by the way. We have three I's. Intellect, which is calculative, measurable. Intuition is the second I, which is beyond mathematics. And third is interconnectedness.
Right.
The three I's. That's why we have something called the 3PI model, which is our state-of-the-art leadership model. So that's where some work could be done, how to establish the interconnectedness, how to help a leader connect with the people around. As you rightly pointed out when you talked about Prime Minister, that it need not be that I am the boss, I am the servant. I'm the servant, I'm here to serve you, I'm to serve the mission. So that has to be brought out through the work that you have done. And the final point I would like is the photonic consciousness. Photonic consciousness. I had the privilege to meet Satyam Bose in my school. I don't know, when I was 8 years old, I went to the same school as Professor Sen. He was invited. And I, that time, was perhaps 8 or 10. It was in 1960s. Now, I noticed his button was not properly kept. It was tilted the way it, because his consciousness was not there. Now, what I wanted to make, consciousness itself is relative. What I am conscious of, someone else may not be conscious of.
You're right. Yes.
It's a relative. And I think we have to bring that thought into our play. So in that spirit, Joy, with your permission, let's invite Dr. Mrittunjoy with Anupam Jha, because he raised some very good point, to the leadership school as School of Leadership Fellows. So that they become permanent members.
And also reflecting souls in the imagination lab.
And in the imagination. We are also creating an imagination lab, which are inaugurating on the July 4th, which is the 250th anniversary of independence of the United States. So it's an auspicious moment where we will open this, and both of you are invited to become fellows. And the reason, Mr. Jha, Dr. Jha, I've invited you, because you made a very interesting point in your question, which we'll not discuss now. But these are the kind of youthfulness that we want to bring into play. So with that, I pass it back to Dr. Sen.
Yeah, I think this has been a wonderful evening. I think it has been a quantum point. Yeah, whatever quantum point is, I think we traveled. I think the best thing which has happened in this lecture, as Dr. Ghosh, we became explorers, Huang Sang, Swami Vivekananda, Adi Shankaracharya, or Ibn Battuta, traveling across Asia and Europe and taking the knowledge from Persia to Iberia, Alhambra and Seville and all those places. So I think that was the best part which I felt. We are traveling, and I think your talk was like, it was giving us electrical signals to travel from, one domain of knowledge, not the right word, one level of knowledge to another level of knowledge.
I would say bosonic signals.
Yeah, bosonic. And without the significance of the Pauli's exclusion principle. So it becomes a boson. Yeah, it becomes a boson.
Bosonic.
Professor Singh, I would just like to, very humbly place in front of Professor Ghosh that, I really resonate with his first point, which is that we should not have this false sense of triumphalism, as it were, because I am not a proponent of that at all. Because I often see that we had everything, right? This is a statement that is often flung, right? Now that doesn't help, right? Because sure, you did, but how does that affect in our lives, right? How does it affect us in our times, right? So for instance, there was for the longest time this idea that rationality is not needed for understanding the greater reality. For instance, this was a point, very simple point that has been spoken of, and I have spoken about this in the presentation itself. But if you dig a little, deeper, right, there is a Navya Nyaya and Nyaya school of thought that actually very rigorously, right, using rational kind of constructs, looking at various aspects of reality itself, has approached that question as well, right? So there was one book that was published by Motilal Banarsi Das of mine, which talks exactly on that, right? So I don't want to believe in things by itself as a scientist, right, as a person who believes in exploring things to the last mile, and I really resonate with the fact that we should not be triumphalist in our approach to this. Yeah.
I think absolutely right. And I think if you look at the first 1 year of interaction between Swami Vivekananda and Sri Ramakrishna, the first 1 year of interaction between Adi Shankaracharya and Shureshwar, Mandan Mishra, they're all at the rational plane. And especially the first, 6 months of interaction between Buddha and those 5 young boys at Sarnath, they're all at the rational plane. There was no magic. There was no given. They're all questions and answers. And then Buddha slowly handholded them and took them to higher and higher planes of understanding based on what were their responses. It was not a forced attribute. So I think it's a whole ladder, from instinct to reason, and then from reason to inspiration. I think there is a point in knowledge where inspiration suddenly comes in. But till that point is attained, it's better to go by reason and reason itself. Until reason doesn't come to us, then we just remain at the level of instinct. And instinct just leads to violence. Only instinct leads to violence. So I think the human planes, these are the words of Swami Vivekananda. I'm just quoting his works. Most of the humanity, which is animalistic, walks at the instinct plane. Once reason improves, then I think today my wife was telling. I mean, there's a quote that we manufacture weapons, to do wars and stop wars. But today we are manufacturing wars, so that we can sell our weapons. Yeah. So I think we are going more by instincts right now, rather than by the original reason that why we should have a war, to stop further wars. That's it. I think we are making fundamental mistakes in global leadership right now, and the world is going through a.
I think, Joy, we should continue this discussion in another session.
Yeah, it'll be, yeah.
Because this is a very important what we discussed today, but this was just the first.
Yeah, this was just the first. I think I'll invite Mrittunjoy again for a part 2 somewhere later in time.
Part 2.
And
Mrittunjoy is based where? In Delhi?
In Delhi, NCR.
In Delhi.
That's why you are sweating quite a lot. It's quite hot out there.
It's really humid right now.
Yeah, because Delhi has become like Kolkata, and Kolkata has become like Delhi.
Yes.
So it's a quantum shift. It's a quantum
right.
shift. And United Kingdom has 37 degrees today.
Yes.
And about
it's bloody cold. In Boston, it's very cold.
I know.
That's why I'm feeling very cold. In fact, I'm
right.
Yeah.
In fact, I should close
So great.
Yeah.
So I think with taking permission from Partha and everybody here, Prasanta, you're still around. Yeah, so I think, Prasanta, thank you for being here today. Immense thanks to Subroto from Houston.
I think.
Yeah, so Subroto is like the Ghatak, us to you. Yeah. So he was discussing about you for a long time. So I'm getting help from so these are like hidden connections. I'm getting the quantum connections. I'm not doing anything. People are helping me. I mean, signals are coming.
Okay, all the best.
Thank you. Take care. Yeah.
Mrittunjoy, stay in touch.
Yes.
Send me an email to me.
Absolutely.
And you can have a one-to-one relationship conversation with.
Absolutely. I look forward to that. I really look forward to that.
Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Stay well. Good day, good morning, and also good night. Yeah.
Good night. Okay, good night. Thank you, Joy. Well done.